The United States and China have once again stepped back from the precipice of a full-blown trade war, extending their fragile truce for another 90 days in a move that signaled a mutual desire to de-escalate tensions and buy more time for complex negotiations, a decision announced just hours before a new wave of punitive tariffs was scheduled to take hold, a scenario that had been escalating throughout the year with increasing rhetoric and economic threats. Welcome viewers to my channel. If you're new here, please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. This reprieve, which is slated to run until November 10th, provides a critical, if still tenuous, window for diplomats and trade officials to tackle a deeply rooted and multifaceted set of grievances that have come to define the relationship between the world's two largest economies. This extension maintains the current, scaled-back tariff structure that was initially established following a round of talks in Geneva in May, a previous de-escalation that saw both nations pull back from even more drastic measures. Under the current terms, the U.S. will continue to impose its 30% levy on Chinese imports, while China will hold its 10% tariff on American goods, a far cry from the triple-digit duties that were on the table earlier in the year and which had sent shockwaves through global markets, raising concerns about the stability of international supply chains. At the height of the tensions, Washington had threatened tariffs as high as 145% on a wide range of Chinese products, a move that prompted Beijing to vow retaliation with duties of 125% on U.S. shipments. The current pause freezes this tit-for-tat escalation, providing a stable, if still tense, foundation for future talks, which are essential because a trade truce is fundamentally different from a formal trade agreement. A truce is merely a temporary ceasefire, a non-binding political commitment that can be broken at any moment by a new executive order or a change in political winds, whereas a formal agreement, which would be enshrined in law and potentially subject to congressional approval, would establish legally enforceable rules and mechanisms for dispute resolution, offering the long-term predictability that the business community desperately craves. This latest extension is not an end in itself but a necessary step to allow negotiators to delve into the core economic and geopolitical issues that fuel this conflict, with the primary objective, as outlined by the White House, being to address trade imbalances and unfair trade practices. At the heart of this argument is the staggering trade deficit the U.S. holds with China, which was reported to be nearly $300 billion in 2024, a number that the Trump administration views not merely as a statistical imbalance but as a symbol of a fundamentally broken and exploitative relationship. While many economists argue that a trade deficit is not inherently bad and can be a sign of a strong economy with high consumption and investment, the administration has framed it as a metric of American decline and a clear sign that the country is being taken advantage of. Beyond the deficit, the talks are also aimed at a host of other critical concerns, including securing fairer market access for American companies, which face significant barriers to entry in the Chinese market, including restrictive regulations, a lack of transparency, and persistent issues with intellectual property theft, which U.S. officials argue costs American businesses billions of dollars annually. Furthermore, the dispute has become deeply intertwined with broader national security and economic issues, such as China's near monopoly on the global supply of rare earth materials, which are vital for everything from military hardware to consumer electronics, a dominance that has given Beijing immense leverage. U.S. officials have also raised concerns about China's purchases of Russian oil, arguing that these transactions provide a financial lifeline to a geopolitical rival and undermine international efforts to isolate Russia. The most critical and contentious front of the trade war, however, is the struggle for technological supremacy, particularly in the semiconductor industry. The U.S. government has imposed strict export controls on advanced technology to prevent it from being used to enhance China's military capabilities or for surveillance purposes. However, the Trump administration recently introduced a controversial and unprecedented policy change that allowed tech giants like Nvidia and AMD to resume sales of certain AI chips to China. But under the condition that they would remit 15% of their revenues from these sales to the U.S. government, a move that has been widely criticized by legal experts and analysts alike as a shakedown that potentially violates the U.S. Constitution's export clause and sets a dangerous precedent for future trade relations, effectively turning a national security matter into a revenue-generating mechanism for the government. The ongoing demand by the U.S. to force a sale of TikTok from its Chinese owner, ByteDance, also remains a significant point of friction, with Washington citing national security risks and Beijing viewing the move as an act of economic coercion aimed at undermining one of its most globally successful tech companies. The Chinese government, for its part, has consistently responded to these pressures by advocating for win-win cooperation, with a spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in Washington stating that suppression and containment will lead nowhere, and calling on the U.S. to lift its unreasonable trade restrictions. This ongoing diplomatic wrangling has had tangible and painful consequences for businesses on both sides of the Pacific. Tariffs, which are essentially a tax on imported goods, have been the central tool of President Trump's trade policy, a strategy he believes will encourage consumers to buy American and force other countries to renegotiate trade terms more favorable to the U.S. However, for many companies, this approach has created an environment of crippling uncertainty that makes long-term business planning nearly impossible. The constant threat of fluctuating tariff rates has left businesses in a state of limbo, as exemplified by Beth Bennick, the founder of Busy Baby, who told BBC Radio 4 that the extension simply prolonged the uncertainty, making it impossible to set accurate pricing for her products. This economic anxiety is not merely anecdotal, it is reflected in the official trade data, which shows a significant decline in commerce between the two nations. U.S. government figures reveal that imports of Chinese goods in June were nearly halved compared to June 2024, a clear indication of the chilling effect of the trade tensions. Over the first 6 months of the year, the U.S. imported $165 billion worth of goods from China, a notable 15% decrease from the same period in the previous year. This ongoing decline is a microcosm of a larger trend where trade uncertainty has a direct and negative impact on investment, supply chain stability, and ultimately, consumer prices. As businesses delay major investment decisions, the risk of a return to a full-blown trade war looms, threatening to trigger further turmoil and economic disruption on a global scale. The origins of this conflict can be traced back decades, far beyond the current administration, to a period when U.S. leaders saw China's entry into the World Trade Organization (WTO) as an opportunity for economic reform and integration, a vision that many now argue failed to materialize as China continued to operate with a state-led economic model that prioritized domestic companies through subsidies and non-tariff barriers, creating what the U.S. has labeled an unlevel playing field. U.S. officials have long criticized China for what they call forced joint ventures, where American companies are pressured to partner with Chinese firms and share sensitive technology in order to gain market access, a practice that the U.S. sees as a direct form of intellectual property theft. The current administration has chosen to bypass traditional trade dispute mechanisms like the WTO, arguing that they are too slow and ineffective, in favor of direct, bilateral pressure through the use of tariffs. The economic impact of these policies has been uneven across different sectors. For example, U.S. farmers, particularly soybean growers, have been hit hard by retaliatory tariffs from China, a key market for their products, leading to a significant drop in exports and necessitating government bailouts to help them stay afloat. Similarly, American manufacturers that rely on Chinese components have faced increased costs, forcing them to either absorb the expenses, raise prices for consumers, or look for alternative suppliers, a process known as supply chain diversification that is often costly and time-consuming. On the other hand, some domestic industries have seen a boost in demand for their products as tariffs make imports more expensive, though this has come at the cost of higher prices for consumers. The legal and ethical debate surrounding the U.S. government's revenue sharing agreement with chip makers like Nvidia and AMD has intensified, with legal scholars arguing that the arrangement could be challenged in court as an unconstitutional form of a direct tax on exports, while critics in the tech industry have warned that it sets a dangerous precedent and could damage America's reputation as a reliable business partner. The U.S. rationale for its broad restrictions on semiconductor sales is rooted in a fear of technological dual use, where seemingly civilian technology could be used to advance China's military capabilities, particularly in the areas of artificial intelligence, high-performance computing, and advanced surveillance systems. The U.S. government believes that by controlling the flow of these critical components, it can slow down China's technological and military modernization.